Hello, I'm Bruce Cunningham, the Dean of the Sanford School. And on behalf of Sanford, I'd like to welcome all of you to the Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecture. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. Turn off your cell phones if you haven't already. As for format, just so you understand where we're going, Senator Lugar will first give an address, 15 minutes or so, take a few questions from me to start a discussion, and we hope to have an interactive conversation with everybody who's here. And I'll thank you in advance to keep your questions reasonably focused and not overly extensive in length. The Sanford Distinguished Lecture was endowed by a gift to Duke from the William R. Keenan Jr. Charitable Trust. Its purpose is to invite a distinguished person in public life to deliver a lecture to the Duke community and also to spend some time with Duke students. Our speaker has certainly done that today, and by the end of the day, he'll have spent almost 7 hours with fellow students and colleagues in different forums here at the university. The language of the endowment fund notes that Sanford lecturers shall be, and I quote, men and women of the highest personal and professional stature, such as presidents, prime ministers, and cabinet ministers, chief executive officers of corporations, visionary artists, and esteemed scholars. We view this lecture as our most prestigious because it honors the founder of the Sanford School in his extraordinary public service, first as a member of the 82nd Airborne during World War II, and then as the greatest governor in the history of North Carolina, president of Duke for 15 years, U.S. Senator from North Carolina, and finally as the professor of the practice of public policy here at the school that bears his name. Past Sanford lecturers have included Nobel laureates and heads of state, and I might add Senator Lugar himself, whom I'd like to welcome back to Duke. Senator Lugar is a visionary who, in his dedication to public service, has always done what he thought was right. An Eagle Scout, a Rhodes Scholar, mayor of Indianapolis, and senator from Indiana for 36 years, Dick Lugar, during his career, supported economic sanctions against South Africa to help end apartheid, was an early supporter of sustainable energy research and global food security, led the campaign for nuclear disarmament after the end of the Cold War, and crossed party lines to support a range of issues, from the ban on assault weapons, the TARP program, and the auto industry, to the START Treaty and the confirmation of Supreme Court Justices Sotomayor and Kagan. In the course of his career, he has won countless accolades from many quarters for his many accomplishments in public service. He was named Outstanding Legislator by the American Political Science Association, was named by Time magazine as one of America's 10 best senators. The Pentagon awarded him the nation's highest civilian defense award, the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, for his leadership with Sam Nunn in effecting the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, known as Nunn-Lugar, that reduced nuclear threats and deactivated over 7,600 nuclear warheads. Along the way, he has received 46 honorary degrees. President Obama, in a tribute to him last year, lauded their shared notion of public service as doing not what's popular at the moment, but what's right for our nation. Senator Lugar, even when it was apparent that some of his votes in the Senate would leave him vulnerable to attack by his fellow Republicans, has always voted for what he believed was right for the country. His statement last May on the concluded 2012 Indiana Senate primary, which he lost, summed up his philosophy. Ideology cannot be a substitute for a determination to think for yourself, for a willingness to study an issue objectively, and for the fortitude to sometimes disagree with your party or even your constituents. Like Edmund Burke, he said he believed that leaders owe the people they represent their best judgment. Underscoring his national role as a spokesman for bipartisan principles, Senator Lugar has joined former Presidents Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush, as well as others, on the board of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, an organization that will promote bipartisanship and civility in U.S. governance. He has also been appointed as a distinguished professor at Indiana University and the University of Indianapolis, which has launched the Richard Lugar Academy, an institution that will prepare newly elected officials for their public roles and develop an internship and study program for students in Washington. His long career in public service clearly has not ended. Rather, it's prepared him for a new one that is just beginning. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you the Sanford Distinguished Lecture for 2013, Senator Richard Lugar.
It's the best way.
You have to walk around.
Thank you. Dean, I thank you very, very much for those very generous remarks of introduction. And I'm extremely honored to be at Duke University again today, and especially at the Stanford School. I had the great pleasure, as has been mentioned, of serving in the United States Senate with Terry Sanford. We served also together on the Foreign Relations Committee. And I was inspired by his concept of, quote, outrageous ambition, which undergirded his innumerable achievements, including the founding of this school. It is a great pleasure and honor to be back to deliver this lecture this evening. Now, in a few hours, another lecture will occur. President Obama will address the nation on his priorities for the next 4 years. And although he had a safe margin of victory in November in the Electoral College, his percentage of the popular vote barely cleared 50%. Many of the nearly half of Americans who voted against him are manifestly resistant to reconciliation. And he must deal with a highly partisan Congress, where the ranks of centrists in both parties have been diminished. Across a wide range of domestic and foreign policy issues, there is a common perception that Americans are inextricably divided in ways that we were not several decades ago. I was struck by a report in the Washington Post this weekend of inauguration that recounted how workers at a factory in the small town of Fremont, Ohio, had segregated themselves ideologically to the point that the facility's 2 break rooms were divided between Obama supporters and detractors. Common perceptions are not always correct, and it's one of the roles of the great School of Public Policy here at Sanford School to test political assumptions. We should be skeptical of claims that the current era of partisanship is unrivaled, especially in a country that fought a civil war, more recently went through the upheavals associated with the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. But we have to come to grips with the repeated failure of our national government to respond to obvious problems, such as the budget deficit. And we cannot ignore the increasingly uncivil tone that penetrates American political dialogue. For this reason, one of my first acts upon retirement was to join the board of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, an organization that includes President George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, along with Senator Tom Daschle, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, a number of other officials who believe that too much of American political rhetoric has become destructive. The question all of us must ask is whether today's partisanship is merely the cyclical intensification of a common condition of American democracy that echoes back to the founders, or at least to the Jefferson-Hamilton split within George Washington's cabinet, or whether it's the source of fundamental dysfunction within our government that requires not just awareness and patience, but a solution. My own view is that our current partisan atmosphere is unique in character, if not intensity. More troubling, it is unlikely to recede without a concerted effort to change our political culture and institutions. Partisanship is a necessary byproduct of our democracy, but we see innumerable examples of both parties failing the most basic tests of governance. Congress has not passed an annual budget resolution in almost 4 years. During 2012, congressional leaders were so pessimistic about the prospects for legislating in an election year that by May, almost every important issue had been deferred to the lame duck session in November and December. Even then, on the important issue of the so-called fiscal cliff, Congress and the President were capable only of last-minute fix that merely deferred budget battles for a couple of months. Now, for me, the most compelling evidence that partisanship is out of control is the degree to which it has penetrated foreign policy deliberations. It was never strictly the case that, quote, politics stops at the water's edge, but there almost always was an undercurrent of bipartisan cooperation between party leaders on national security that facilitated joint action in a crisis. That is not the case today. Increasingly, congressional foreign policy involvement is starting and stopping with simplistic debate on immediate foreign policy controversies that are reflected in the 24-hour news cycle. Congress is largely failing to pursue systematic reviews of the most strategically important questions in foreign policy. These include whether the administration's proposed pivot to Asia, for example, is well considered, what an anti-terrorist campaign spanning decades should look like, how we should respond to global resource constraints. Faced with reflexive partisan roadblocks, Congress has retreated from legislating on foreign policy. Congress has not passed a comprehensive foreign affairs authorization bill since 1985, and a serious attempt by both houses to do so has not occurred since 2005. Treaty ratification during the Obama administration has come to a virtual standstill. Some of you may be aware of the partisan travails facing high-profile treaty debates, such as the Disabilities Convention recently and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But in the last Congress, even non-controversial, job-producing tax treaties with friendly countries, such as Hungary, Luxembourg, and Switzerland, have been held up. During foreign policy crises, Congress has been unable to muster a consensus for legislative action. In 2002, Congress authorized the military intervention in Iraq that came the following year. But Congress was unable to coalesce behind a unified perspective as the war evolved. In 2011, as President Obama committed the United States to hostilities in Libya without a congressional vote, Congress was unable to effectively defend its prerogatives or even decide on the terms of a meaningful debate on the issue. Senator Chuck Hagel's recent difficulties during the Senate's consideration of his nomination to be Secretary of Defense offer another current example of the politicization of national security policy. Senator Hagel, in my judgment, is clearly qualified for the position, and he reflects the President's views on many issues. In fact, if a Democrat with the same qualifications as Senator Hagel had been nominated, that candidate would have been confirmed with relatively little controversy. On most issues, Chuck Hagel is more conservative than Senator John Kerry, who was confirmed as Secretary of State with only 3 negative votes. Senator Hagel's main transgression is that he is a Republican who has questioned policies that are sacred among most conservative senators. These include whether the surge in Iraq was worth the lives lost, whether the current high levels of defense expenditures make strategic sense, whether nuclear forces can be reduced further, and whether there are non-military options in dealing with Iran. And one can disagree with his views on these questions, as many senators clearly do. But overall, the intensity of opposition that Senator Hagel is encountering is grounded in the resentments of some conservatives inside and outside the Senate who regard his independent thinking as political blasphemy, for which he should not be rewarded. We've heard some commentators assert that the Republican Party has become, in fact, so rigid that even President Ronald Reagan would not be regarded as a conservative today. Ideologically, President Reagan's devotion to the principles of smaller government, entrepreneurship, and personal freedom matched any of today's conservative leaders. But President Reagan also embraced compromise and other necessities of governance that many conservatives now reject. He began most of his policy battles by espousing conservative principles, but he did not let his ideology paralyze his fundamental responsibility to govern. Many Republican members of Congress today are unwilling to risk any appearance of accommodation for fear that it might conflict with their pledges or the purity of their rhetoric. A no-compromise vision of conservatism may score points with conservative talk show hosts and campaign givers, but in a democracy, leadership requires an office holder to compromise, to prioritize, and sometimes to reverse oneself. A pure application of President Reagan's philosophy would have prevented some of his most important accomplishments, including the 1983 agreement to extend the solvency of Social Security, the 1986 tax reform bill, and his outreach to the former Soviet Union on arms control. Our system is producing fewer leaders who are placing governance above ideological purity. This has several causes, including Supreme Court decisions that have allowed non-attributable and unlimited political expenditures, and redistricting processes that have created many uncompetitive congressional districts that reward extremism in both parties. But perhaps the most potent force driving partisanship is the rise of a massive industry that makes money off of political discord. This industry encompasses cable news networks, talk radio shows, partisan think tanks, direct mail fundraisers, innumerable websites and blogs, social media, and gadfly candidates and commentators. Many of these entities have a deep economic stake in perpetuating political conflict. They are successfully marketing and monetizing partisan outrage. In some cases, these partisan practitioners are true believers, whose economic interests coincide with their political views. But in some cases, they are just executing a business model predicated on appealing to the prejudices and fears of their adherents. This industry has expanded in conjunction with the development of communication technology. As news sources have proliferated and consumers have moved away from newspapers and the broadcast television, the economic model of traditional journalism, as well as its standards, have become increasingly difficult to sustain. Outside the constraints of responsible reporting, entrepreneurs have attempted to capture audiences by peddling sensationalism, conspiracy theories, and us versus them mentality. This is not entirely new, of course. Some newspaper giants of the past, such as William Randolph Hearst, for example, were adept at using the power of their papers to drive a political agenda. But before the dawn of the internet, reaching a significant audience was an extremely expensive endeavor. The vast majority of Americans got their news from network television, their local newspaper, and a few dozen newspapers and wire services. Almost all of these sources had a stake in reaching an audience that included people from the entire political spectrum. With today's technology, anyone can start a website or a blog in search of a specialized audience. Many purveyors have found that the entertainment value of inflammatory partisanship and confrontational rhetoric offers the best chance to find and hold readers or viewers. Many Americans now see the president as a socialist, aiming to destroy the American way of life, while others see the Republican Congress as an insensitive tool of the rich, aiming to destroy the poor and middle class. Hyperbole in the media is backed up by the enormous independent expenditures of super PACs and wealthy individuals. And meanwhile, think tanks with overtly partisan aims develop intellectual justifications for the perspectives of their side. The cumulative result is that extremism has a much greater chance of being rewarded electorally than it did even a decade ago. And in my judgment, governance has suffered. Now, under these conditions, how do we establish greater political civility, foster more meaningful policy debates, incentivize public officials to put governance first? The actor who could have the greatest short-term impact is the president himself. President Obama is perfectly situated for leading a campaign to reduce partisanship. He does not have to face an election again. He is a unitary actor. He enjoys overwhelming approval from his base. If I were advising the president on his speech this evening, I would tell him that he must give attention to uniting the country, not just as a means to pass his priorities, but as an end to itself. In his recent inaugural address, President Obama gave the unmistakable impression that he would fight budget battles on a partisan line. Absent from the speech was any signal he intended to tackle the debt in a way that might require sacrifice from anyone other than the very wealthy. But at $16 trillion, the debt is an 800-pound gorilla of American governance. As a practical matter, all other domestic policy depends on constraining the budget while maintaining economic growth. A series of partisan stalemates over tax and spending policy could sink our economy and undercut the president's legacy. A partisan president can be skilled, honest, effective, and even iconic. But if he or she fails to be a unifier who expands the governing coalition beyond 50% and knows when to temper the political demands of supporters, it is difficult to achieve greatness. I would hope the president would call Republican leaders to the White House for extensive talks on the budget and the direction of American foreign policy. These meetings should be private, informal, and unhurried to allow for a real exchange of views. They should also be regularized to improve communications and to build trust. This is not something that the president can delegate. He should commit himself to the hours necessary for this process to succeed. Now, beyond presidential leadership, all who care about the future of our country should be thinking about how we lift ourselves out of political dysfunction. We should be considering how to support candidates who place governance ahead of partisanship and avoid pledges that limit their flexibility. We should be reconsidering campaign finance rules with the aim of at least increasing transparency. And we should be holding public figures in media and politics to a higher standard of civility in their rhetoric. None of this will happen overnight. The essential first step is developing awareness of the problem and joining in the belief that a remedy can be found within our democratic traditions. I thank each one of you tonight for thinking through this problem with me. I look forward to your questions, and I thank especially this institute for giving us the privilege of conversing and meeting together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can get you to sit
Great, great.
So to begin this conversation, you mentioned that if you were asked by the president tonight, you'd give him the advice of giving attention to uniting the country. And some might argue that President Obama in 2009 tried to do that. that he failed because Republicans put the brakes on his legislative platform. Mitch McConnell in October 2010 made the case that his party's primary goal was to make him a one-term president. And Norman Ornstein, who is generally regarded as bipartisan, has made the argument that both sides are not equally culpable, that in fact the GOP has advanced political ends over problem solving and embraced destructive means to oppose anything that might help the Democrats politically. So here's a two-part question. Looking to the past, were the president's problems in his first administration due to his lack of leadership, and he's been criticized for not schmoozing enough with the GOP, or did he start out as a unifier and were too many Republicans dead set against him for him to succeed? So that's the first part. And the second one is looking to the future, other than his not having to face elections and assuming that he takes your advice. Has the last election changed anything within the Republican Party sufficient to make success possible, or has it reinforced partisanship?
I think initially the president may have had the idea of unifying the country. I think that he faced a problem which all politicians face at that point, and that was that the electorate had become consumed with the anguish, really, of unemployment, with the loss of income in so many families, the loss of prospects for their children as parents looked at the future, the decline of many cities and industries in America. This may have been caused in another administration, and certainly had not been resolved by January of 2009. But at least I've found in my conversation with constituents in that particular year and subsequently that these economic problems were very personal and they overwhelmed discussion of almost anything else. And therefore, we right off the bat were in a predicament in which the president probably had a virtually impossible situation of bringing about some degree of conciliation or happiness. I think the administration attempted to carry on some situations the Bush administration had started in terms of economic recovery in the banking system, the automobile industry, and so forth. But I would just say that initially the president decided that maybe he will again. And the first year is the time, if you're going to make headway on big issues, that you've got to move. And so as a result, he selected health care and climate change, cap and trade bill, for example, as areas in which, with good Democratic majorities, apparently in both houses, he had a chance for success in areas that really were not specifically related to jobs, deficits, budget, but were nevertheless very important issues for Americans that had not been solved even back in the Clinton administration and the health care thing, or really brought to a public forum in terms of climate change at all. Pardon me. The climate change thing bogged down, unfortunately, because Americans became divided into red states, blue states, not in the Republican-Democratic situation, but states that had coal and states that did not have coal. And before long, what was a fairly clear piece of legislation, which might have resulted in something of a carbon tax, became a hodgepodge of various concessions to all sorts of groups in a pretty muddied picture that did not really make the grade. I say this as one who joined as a farmer Chicago Climate Exchange, for example. This was the most conspicuous example in America of trying to get a carbon price. And I was storing carbon in my trees out in my walnut groves, getting measurements of that, much to the consternation of Senate colleagues who thought this was all nonsense. But I was building up credits. At one point, carbon was worth $8 a ton, and I could see my fortune mounting, at least to a few $100s. But alas, the whole system collapsed. The 8 became 4, 2, 0, and gone. And this is the problem. We've not really quite come to grips, but it's still out there. With the health care situation, then the president and his party were determined to win at all costs. They had 60 votes in the Senate. All 60 had to be present for each of the cloture votes. And as I recall, there were some 40 to 50 of them. Sometimes they occurred at 3 a.m. on Sunday mornings. We went through weekends. We went through recesses and so forth. But finally, on Christmas Eve, the bill passed, and Obamacare became the law of the land. Now, there may have been political opportunism by Mitch McConnell and others to say the issue is Obama. Obama must go. This is what we have to look at. This is not a particularly statesmanlike activity, but at the same time, the partisanship had been so tough, so vicious throughout all of this, that it did catch Republicans out in the hustings and their favor of all of this. I would just say that at this point, the president does not have ahead of him Obamacare, although we're going to be through all sorts of permutations of rulemaking, how the governors agree on Medicaid, lots of things of this variety. He may tackle climate change again in some form, but maybe in a little different way. And I can think of many ways in which you could make some changes here with the market working to help you that might bring bipartisan support from Lisa Murkowski and Olympia. Well, Olympia is gone now, Susan Collins, other people. But I would say that beyond that, just the idea of unity is very, very important to be thinking about, of governance as opposed to tough partisanship. We amazingly got through the fiscal cliff. Here I credit Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden. They really did come to some accord in the dark of the night, or we would have had falling over the cliff. Now, one can say that this just simply postponed things, and I mentioned that in my talk tonight, for a couple of months, but a couple of months meant a lot to the stock market. At the end of December and January, you had for investors in America about a 6 or 7% increase just due to renewed confidence that somehow the Congress could possibly come to a conclusion of this sort. Now, you asked about the Republican Party, and what was the nuance of that situation?
Assuming that President Obama takes your advice, has the election changed the thinking of those in the Republican Party who essentially spent a lot of time opposing him?
Not yet. So this is why I'm suggesting that he spends some time with these Republicans. He actually not only invites them to the White House ceremoniously, but substantively, they talk a lot. They actually get to know each other. One of the big problems, not only for the president, but for each one of us in the Congress, is that Washington is very different than it was 30 years ago. Now, how does that come? Well, it comes down to the fact that many members, especially the younger House members, take the position that they don't like Washington. As a matter of fact, they want to spend as few hours in Washington each week as possible. So they come in at the last possible moment and leave at the next possible moment. At least 30 are rumored to be living in their offices. So they don't even have to rent, quite apart from purchasing an apartment or some other place to live. This cuts down, to say the least, any conversation, even among members of the House, quite apart from members of the Senate. Thank goodness the Aspen Institute has a Thursday morning breakfast in which there are members of both houses, both parties, usually somewhere between 15 and 25 on a Thursday morning. It was the major way that I had for communicating with any members of the House. The first time I had met most of them, there being no social events that would have brought us together. This is very difficult for legislation, and I didn't want to get into all the weeds tonight in a short speech, but if you're really trying to fashion legislation, you need to have partners in the other body. You need to have people that you know and trust in the conference committee so that, in fact, you can come to compromise. And you can then engender the 60 votes if necessary in the Senate or so forth. That requires at least meeting and knowing the participants in the ballgame. It is impossible currently for that to occur. So this means you have a lot of cipher voting. You've got people ducking in doing their votes, ducking back out because they don't like Washington. It's not a situation of governance in which there's a responsibility to come to decisions. In part, this is why we've not had a budget for 4 years. And you say, well, how can you operate? Even a city government has a budget, a state government. Well, you kick the can down the road, to overuse that expression. You simply say, we use the same figures as last year, modified by X% or this or that or so forth. This means that the committees are basically irrelevant. You can discuss a particular transportation situation of infrastructure or the educational system or the health system or what have you, but you don't authorize any new legislation, any new authorities. You don't appropriate money for things you haven't even authorized. And in essence, this leads, the administration has no alternative, but I suppose to make many arbitrary judgments. There having been no debate, votes, or any guidance by the Congress in the process. So Republicans certainly have contributed to this problem by saying that, particularly after the 2010 election, when they picked up several seats, the 60 became 53, therefore tough to get to 60 votes now, as it was during the Obamacare debate. In most cases, impossible to get to 60 votes. So as a result, very little legislation, very little consideration of treaties. And when you got to the New START Treaty, I spent, seemed like half of my life trying to just guide 13 Republicans across the finish line. But we had to get 67 votes for a treaty. This was a very modest arms control treaty. This is after working on this situation for 2 decades. And you still were back to the same issue we had with Sam Nunn and I when we started this whole thing. Many Republicans saying we don't trust the Russians one whit, not a dime for those Russians. And you can say, well, now listen, the Russians have invited us to come in and take down their missiles, to just help destroy their warheads, to monitor the whole thing on Russian soil, to have some of our troops and a lot of our technicians. You know, this is remarkable in terms of a historical turnaround. But a good number of people then has now said, well, we don't care. This is the money that ought to be spent somewhere else. And so I would just say simply, I feel fortunate that we have managed to keep the non-Lugar thing alive for 22 years. There were a couple of years where so many amendments were offered of reports that had to be made before money could be spent. And in 1 year, we were unable to do anything. The entire year was X'd out by people demanding reports and so forth. It was an issue really never quite decided, but one in which through person-to-person conversation, through literally trying to build coalitions with friends, with acquaintances, with every social opportunity available, you can move things along. Now, absent that, it doesn't happen. And Republicans are responsible for a part of that, but so are many Democrats who are no longer in Washington than the Republicans, sort of in and out Tuesday and Thursday.
Well, beyond presidential leadership then, you suggested in your talk that the remedy to political dysfunction could be found within our democratic tradition by supporting candidates who placed governance over partisanship and avoided ideological inflexibility. But I suppose one of the problems of that argument is that many of the forces that reinforce extremism at the expense of government make the remedy very difficult. You pointed out gerrymandering, a lack of transparency in campaign financing, the massive communications industry that has enabled money to promote political discord. So how do you get presidential, other than presidential leadership, do we get from political dysfunction to governance? How do we get legislators that are different from those who are produced by the electoral system as it currently stands? I mean, how do we get from here to there?
Well, one of the most radical suggestions, but as a practical one, just for sake of discourse, is that primary elections in states, as opposed to being a Republican primary or a Democratic primary, might simply be a single primary. All the candidates, let's say for the Senate or the members of the House, get into the same race. If somebody gets a majority in the first go, they are the winner. But if not, the first two, the top two then, are the candidates in the fall or whenever the election for the general situation is held. In this way, all of the citizens participate. You finally get a majority view. As it stands, one of the reasons why the so-called exterminate rhino effect occurs, rhino being Republican in name only, as people who are supposedly moderates and so forth are called, is that the Republican primary is a vehicle in which, given not only a concerted feeling of Tea Party folks or others, but outside money that may dwarf anything that is being raised or spent in the state as a whole, including outside television ads, social media business, and so forth, you may very well eliminate the rhino, and then you have left whoever the survivor is, and that survivor may not be as well qualified and may not win the election, as a matter of fact, or even be close under those circumstances. I don't mean to personalize this overly, but I would just say that the election 2006, which I won for the 6th term, Democrats did not nominate a candidate in Indiana. That had not occurred historically. But they gauged that enough people apparently were satisfied or pleased with what I was doing, that this was not a useful race to run. Most of the elections before that, we had had 2/3 majorities, and polling indicated approval of about that sort. Now, even in this year in which I lost the primary, why the approval ratings were always well above 50%, sometimes verging higher, even in difficult times. So that the fact was that in a general election, we had a very good chance of succeeding. Because in a general election, the split of independent voters who were not active in the primaries either way, or even many Democrats, might have voted in our way and had historically in the past get to the 2/3 majorities. But we never got to that point. Now that occurred in other states from time to time. This has meant that moderates, whether they're in the Senate or in the House, have been reduced now to single digits. And so there's really not much there when you're talking about finding some course in the middle or others to get into bipartisan legislation. Occasionally, some brave spirit on a subject that has perhaps not been given so much attention by any particular interest group may join hands. But nevertheless, one reason Marco Rubio is going to give a speech tonight in answer to the president is that Marco Rubio has taken a stance that looks very favorable toward immigration legislation. Well, he's been very skillful in moving this along to retain a good bit of right-wing support in the process. That doesn't mean he's home free. Rand Paul is also giving a speech tonight as the spokesperson for the Tea Party groups. And now Rand is reasonably complimentary of Marco, although they may be rivals. But it's an interesting factor that the leadership of the Republican Party answering the president tonight will be these two individuals who have barely 2 years of experience in national public life and are distinguished only on the fact that Marco Rubio has talked about immigration, courageously as the case may be and constructively. And Rand Paul essentially is not in favor of having a foreign policy at all, as far as I can tell. He would be in favor of non-intervention sort of across the board, which is an interesting point of view. But to have these two people conspicuously out there is certainly an interesting dilemma. And it happens in part because, and maybe I've carried this too far, Mitch McConnell, who is our Republican leader, in the Senate is under fire in Kentucky. People are writing articles every day that the Tea Party, and not only that, maybe the Cook Brothers and Club for Growth and Freedom Works and all the rest are out to take care of him. And McConnell understands this, and he is resisting it. He said, I'm going to fight back. And he's already raised millions of dollars in the first couple of months. And this is the leader of the Republican Party. Now, this is the guy that's got to be reaching across the aisle to Harry Reid or to the president or so forth, if in fact what we're talking about occurs. But here for 2 years, he's going to be drumbeat in this way, which does not bode well, really, for the leadership of situation in the party.
So just to try and follow up on that, I mean, the analysis you made of the problems that exist because of gerrymandering, lack of financial, campaign finance reform, and those kinds of things. Lacking that, how do we change the system? Do we rely on grassroots to simply begin a process that bubbles up, or where do people go to start that process?
This may be blithely optimistic, but I believe that probably the economy is recovering slowly, that the trends are in the right direction in housing, in manufacturing, in our trade balance, in our stock markets thus far, in agricultural commodities. To make the point, I believe that if unemployment comes out of the 8% range down to 4 or something of that variety, there's going to be a very different attitude in the American public. That may be blithely optimistic, but on the other hand, I see a lot of the current dilemma as anguish, as hurt. The constituents that I've visited with in the last couple of years in Indiana don't want to talk about anything else. It couldn't give any care whatever as to what's going on in Afghanistan, quite apart from Arab Spring, or even whether nuclear holocaust might occur. The whole thing boils down to their personal anguish, and they spill that out. And you go to a group of people, particularly people who are 60 and over, and they seem to be the most vituperative, the most angry, the most anguished. So there's no conversation. We're talking about governance, and they're not interested in governance. They believe, as a matter of fact, that the whole lot, all 435 representatives and 100 senators ought to go. Sweep the whole crowd out of there. They ought to have more severe term limits. Get rid of all that crowd. They're the ones that, not alone, because the elderly people don't have that much percentage of our population, but this is why you have maybe 9, 10, or 11% approval of the Congress, with the other 80% disapproving. Or about the best any party can do is 30%. Well, this is a very, very severe problem when you have this amount of disillusionment, anguish, anger, what have you. I don't see how that's going to change until there really is more optimism, more change in the economy, more people getting jobs, more of a sense, really, of stability of families in this instance. Obviously, this anguish is not true of all families in America, thank goodness. And for people who are not experiencing this, why, they're saying, my goodness, this is ridiculous, these people carrying on, these extremists and so forth. But a lot of these causes are being supported because these people believe that their anger can be expressed in various ways. And then, as I suggested in my speech, there are entrepreneurs who are opportunists, who are literally commercializing the anger, monetizing it. If you want to be angry, we can even show you more anger. We can fix ads and movies and whatever else it is. We can, in fact, in the social media, burrow around in all sorts of ways that will really agitate people. We're masters at it. It's sort of an artistry as opposed really to a political debate.
Well, maybe we ought to turn this over to the audience now. There are mics upstairs and downstairs. So if you want to ask a question, just stand up and get behind the mic, identify yourself, and ask a question.
Yes, sir. Well, I'm certain they did. It's a good question, but I'd have to go back in my own memory to remember exactly what I was doing all the way through this period of time. I think that probably as time went on and I became involved, particularly with the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, and I shouldn't say a feeling of saving the country or saving the world, but at least devoting extensive time, really, to trying to deal not only with the Congress, but with the Russians or the Chinese or whoever else it is, that probably more of my time was devoted to the work in the Foreign Relations Committee as chairman or ranking member. That was the case certainly when I was in the first term of being a senator, maybe in the first couple of terms. Likewise, I found as time went on that ambassadors from most of the countries that are in Washington, there are about 150 represented, frequently would advise their heads of state or their foreign ministers if they came to Washington, it's fine to try to get an appointment with the White House or with Secretary of State or Defense, but you ought to go over to Congress. Then our phone would ring and they would indicate they would very much like to bring by their prime minister or their foreign minister or what have you. And I felt that was important to see these representatives of other countries. We built up quite a Rolodex in the course of 36 years of all these folks. But nevertheless, it made for a much more crowded schedule. I tried to see all of our Indiana constituents coming to Washington. I tried to see all of these foreign visitors that were coming. I tried to make all the roll call votes at the committee meetings, meetings of the party, and so forth, which meant at least a 12, 13, 14-hour day. And that extended, I'm sure, over the course of time. So that I think probably in a political sense, in the last 3 or 4 years, although my constituents, at least in groups like this, would say, well, we're delighted that you are trying to help out with the rest of the world and so forth. But I'm not certain that was shared by a majority of my constituents. I think maybe they said, we don't quite understand what he is doing. He ought to be talking about unemployment, jobs, the deficit, what have you, or Obama must go, or something, agenda of that variety. And so in other words, they said, well, that's your choice, but nevertheless, in our anguish, we really need somebody who is shouting and carrying on, as opposed to somebody who is involved in the so-called governance business that I'm extolling today.
You talked about the hope for changing the divisiveness based on the economy. There are a lot of people who believe the macroeconomic trends are such that we're not going to get to 4% anytime soon. Given that and the low standing of both the political parties and the Congress, do you believe that there's a possibility now, unlike any other, for a third party?
No, I don't see the likelihood of a third party. I think that we're probably going to have the ones we have, for better or for worse. But I think that the third party situation doesn't arise because it's not really clear that anybody enunciates a program for the country. In other words, conceivably a candidate, and I'm just using my imagination, might come forward and say, I just want to talk about anguish, anger, disillusionment, nastiness, and it's off with your heads, all you congressmen, and so forth. Now, conceivably, there's enough of a constituency of sort of annihilation or anarchy, but I don't think so. I think this is one reason why I made this suggestion of the single primary. This really negates the possibility of this sort of thing occurring. You finally get back, I think, to a majority winner, and it's going to be somebody from the Republican or Democratic parties, and I think that is healthier than entertaining the third party option.
First of all, Senator, thank you very much for being here with us today. My name is Abhisanka. I'm a freshman here at Duke, and my question to you is, what advice do you have for the next generation, for those of us who may aspire to be in public service, but also for those of us who may simply wish to be active citizens?
Well, I've been very impressed we've had 3 wonderful classes or groups today for extensive discussion. We ask each of the students to identify themselves in terms of where they come from, but likewise some of their interests, how they see their potential careers evolving. A good number were interested, as I am, in feeding the world and nutrition problems, and a number have already had internships or some scholarship work in African states, a couple in Asia. But in any event, their questions, their comments, the dialogue that we had, I thought was extremely helpful to me in terms of my optimism about how many young people right here at Duke and the Sanford School are already well on their way of being prepared. I sort of gave the standard advice that I always give, and that is study hard. Be a comprehensive scholar now and be prepared to do that for the rest of your life. Because you really have to have the competence that comes with understanding others' mistakes as well as some potential original breakthroughs of your own thinking. Then be able to express yourself with speeches, with op-eds, with all the ways in which you may be able to debate or respond, just as we were doing in our classes today. Very important if you're going to persuade anybody at any time. And then finally, the scholarship is especially important once you come to the thought of reaching conclusions and programs and trying to convince somebody of your opinion. Because if you're not well prepared, your scholarship is deficient, so are your remedies going to be. This may lead to some very unfortunate results if you're given responsibility, and as a matter of fact, your solutions turned out to be deficient or harmful. And I think that most of these students are at a point in which they're trying to discover how you enter the world of decision making, at home and abroad, or at what level. And there's no specific answer to that. It was interesting for me just to review in response to questions all of the chapters of my life that were totally unpredictable, that there's no flow in which I can't claim as a boy or a high school student I could see all of this coming out. As a matter of fact, I didn't see any of it in the way that it finally occurred. I suppose the facts are that I was prepared when opportunities came. I was lucky that maybe the politics at that particular time were right, or the mood of the country, or my constituents. But likewise, I saw opportunities. For instance, the Unigov movement in Indianapolis when I was mayor, first year, I saw the fate of our city, and I looked at this as president of the National League of Cities elsewhere, was really going to be dependent upon Indianapolis being a whole city, inner city and outer city all together, suburbs, with one mayor, one council, one ability related to speak to the needs of all of the people at a time of high-profile civil rights difficulties. We obtained that in the legislature through one-on-one conversations with all 150 members, and got signatures by the governor and the state Supreme Court ruling that it made all the difference in the world in the life of Indianapolis. We grew dramatically. Investment flowed in. I was able to cut property taxes 5 years out of 8. Therefore, the program became somewhat popular, although 30% of the population never liked the idea. Black Hoosiers said, "You're taking away a city we're about to govern." Caucasians said, "We spend good money trying to get out of this whole mess. How dare you bring us all back into it?" But nevertheless, there was a cadre of young people at that time, and I was 35 years of age when I was elected mayor, who said the fate of this city, our whole future, really relies upon this moment in history in which we finally bring it together and make Indianapolis a great city with great opportunities. We want to live for the next 30 or 40 years, and therefore we better go for it. This is what I hope is the case with the students that I saw today, that they will, wherever they land, and I became a very improbable mayor. There hadn't been a Republican elected for over 20 years, and it was unlikely ever to be one, and the mayor who was there was a good man. But at the same time, somehow or other, I won the election and moved the city in this direction. And so this led to a lot of changes in my life, in the life of my farm came inside the city limits. That was quite a change, to say the least. We could no longer have cattle and hogs, really a granular tree business now. But those sort of opportunities occur unexpectedly. That was true with my school board business. I was out trying to save the factory with my brother, who had some engineering ability. I had none, but I was trying to use some ingenuity in terms of getting Export-Import Bank financing. And we got the E Award for Export Excellence from President Kennedy, the first Indiana corporation to do that, because somehow we took a very small company and started exporting to Mexico, and then to South America, and then to the Philippines, and grew to 100 employees. And so that was an exciting period. Likewise, it had nothing to do with politics, had everything to do with at least saving our family and our farm and so forth. But I had some sense of the difficulties people had in those directions. Trying to pay off debt, and trying to meet labor management negotiations. And these are important affairs. Not many members of Congress now have managerial experience. Fewer and fewer have served as mayors or governors or executives in a reasonably large corporation. So as a result, you have people who have very strong opinions, my way or the highway, but they've had no particular reason to come to decisions of governance in which continuity of institutions really has been at stake. Now that may change someday. And as voters, you can help change it by having people who really have that kind of experience. Now, Terry Sanford being a great example. A governor and president of Duke for 16 years or so. This really is governance of decision-making of all sorts, private and public.
Yeah, my name is Steve Rembrandt, and I have 3 questions. Short ones relate to your presentation. One, you kind of alluded to what I call the California model, where
yes,
the two people who have the highest votes, whether Republicans or Democrats, are the ones who run in the final election. And can you discuss, is there a movement throughout the country to do that? Makes a lot of sense. Secondly, somewhat related, is there's a lot of bright people in Congress, but you only have 11% approval rating. So you wonder about the House representative and the senators kind of say, hey, we got a problem here. Only 11% of the people approve of what we're doing. And then the third item is you also mentioned that with people going back and forth to their home districts, and they're only in town for 3 days, this doesn't give an opportunity for people to get to know each other. And you're the third person who's been at Duke. I think David Brooks and Bob Woodward, and you said the same thing. Is there any movement to change that? Lengthen the time so people get to know one another?
Not for the moment. I would say that the predominant view is still the leaders on both sides trying to humor their constituents are trying to cut short the sessions. And so as a result, if you read Roll Call or Politico or The Hill, they'll often have a column, Senate in or out. And there are a lot of outs. As a matter of fact, even with our Aspen situation, we had about only 2/3 as many breakfasts last year because the House decided to be out every third week arbitrarily. And unless both houses were in, why, there was no breakfast. And so we were still, I'm afraid, in that mold that hasn't changed, which is unfortunate. I have a question about the Republicans before your second question. What was that now? I forgot.
The California model.
Oh, the California model. No movement toward that in most states, although there's been some discussion, I've noted in a few legislatures in this month, in which many are convening now. Most people, however, recognize that the decennial census offered legislatures in their last year's session to redistrict and to do so in behalf of constituents, senators who were, or rather members of the House more particularly, who were sitting there. The anguish occurred, take the California situation, where somehow two Democrats got thrown together who were both incumbents on 2 or 3 cases and this type of thing. But this has led, as some political scientists have pointed out, to a situation in which the number of votes cast for Democrats for the House of Representatives total was substantially greater than the number cast for Republicans as a total. But Republicans have a 33-vote majority or so in the House. So you say, well, how can this be? The Republicans have a big House majority. If they got fewer votes, well, because things were districted in a way in which the Democrats all voted unanimously for somebody and ran up the total. But that's not the same thing I'm talking about. This really moves in the opposite direction. And given the fact that the decennial census just occurred a couple of years ago, why we've still got 8 years to run before we have another one, unless there really is a passion for reform of the public as a whole. And I don't know whether there is. A lot of talk about the super PACs, non-transparency, whether it's the Cook brothers or the gentleman that put from Las Vegas $100 million into the last campaign or so forth. The fact is that those of us who are just politicians in states are being outspent by other people who are coming in, doing their own ads outside, sometimes more skilled than we are in using the social media. Now, I don't think that's a very good idea for our democracy, but some people say this is freedom of speech. First Amendment. That's why the court ruled that way. So these are some fundamental problems that we still have to wrestle with, but we have to identify them to begin the wrestling match.
Hi, I'm a first-year law student across the street, actually. And my first question is, you say that there needs to be more reaching out from Obama in some informal arena with the Republican members of Congress. Would you say that, first of all, has Obama done less of that than the previous administrations you've seen during your time in Congress? And the second question would be, considering there seems to be a movement in the Republican Party that you know very well to be seen as doing anything but cooperating with the president, do you think that how much good would that accomplish to have these kind of informal meetings?
Well, to answer your first question, I think there's been much less contact by the president, but then I think many Democrats would say that too, that there just has not been this type of situation. No, the president's time is very valuable. Listening to all of the chatter and conflict that this brings is not appetizing. But at the same time, all I'm saying, in the same way that members of Congress are not even meeting with each other or getting to know each other, this is especially crucial with regard to the president. He is hopeful that his own leadership, that the followers of what he has to say will be convinced and that he will not really have to dig in the trenches and work this thing out. I think, however, that he would be very surprised that if he did spend this time, it would be time well spent. I think, as a matter of fact, that it would be much more difficult for many Republicans to remain so polarized they might come into the first meeting and say, by golly, I really told the president, I really, gave him this and that and so forth. But by the second or third time, my guess is that you begin to have a very different sort of impression. My own views about this may have been colored by the fact I was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee when Barack Obama came to the Senate. He was the least ranking Democrat. I admired the fact that he stayed until we went back and forth. It might be 2 hours before he got his questions to the witnesses. We were the only two people left in the room, and I've complimented him on that. So he took me up on that. He said, I know you go to Russia every August. I'd like to go with you this time. So I said, okay. So we went out to Russia together. We were confined, I won't say incarcerated, but had quite a time in Perm, where somebody apparently felt that I was a spy, and were trying to get onto our Air Force plane. The Ravens were guarding the plane, the enlisted personnel, and we were stuck in the basement of the Perm airport for quite a period of time. And I told Brock, just cool it, take a nap. This is likely to go on for a while. I hoped it was not going to go on for several days, but after a few hours, in fact, inexplicably, we were released, and it was quite an initiation for poor Barack, his first trip to Russia within the first week. But we went on to Ukraine, saw all the fears of that government that they were about to have their gas cut off, which did occur following December 31st. I went on to Baku to see the first oil dropping out of the Baku-Jehan pipeline and all that might mean and so forth. So we got back, and Barack said, let's offer some legislation. So we had the Lugar-Obama bill. Well, you can imagine, I wasn't concerned, but nevertheless somewhat nonplussed. When it came to the debate in the presidential election, they said, well, Mr. Obama, have you ever passed anything in Congress? Oh, yeah. He said, the Lugar-Obama bill, this saved this and that and so forth. And so I thought, oh, my goodness, this is bad enough. But then the next question came, and he said, how about that reverend out in Chicago that, that he was having trouble with? He said, pay no attention to him. If I want financial advice, I call Warren Buffett. Well, that sounded pretty good. He said, if I want foreign policy advice, I call Dick Lugar. And I thought, oh, my, here we go again. But I mention this because as a personal person that we're talking about today, dealing person to person with members, he could be very, very effective. I think it just simply has not been in the cards, so I'm suggesting strongly that it should be, because we've got to have some breakthroughs at some point. And my guess is that this is a good time for him to do this. He does have another election coming up. He does have a country that's still in this turmoil we're talking about, sort of kick everybody out. I think this would be appreciated by the country.
Hello, Senator. My name is Ji-Hae Lee, and I am a master's in public policy student at Stanford. Hello. Thank you so much for your time. You mentioned about how partisan our political system is today, and especially for somebody who's a young adult in their late 20s, I'm having a hard time finding a party to place myself in. I feel that the Democrats seem to be not focused. The Republicans seem a little too ideological. However, with me, I am more fiscally responsible, but socially progressive. So my question to you would be, do you think it's more likely to have a third party movement, or do you think it's actually more possible for them to be a identity change within the Democratic or Republican Party?
Well, I think it's possible that one or the other parties will adopt policies or at least take on this governance thing we're talking about, make decisions that may make it easier for you to make that choice. I would be hopeful as a Republican that you would tilt that way, but I understand that you're objectively looking at this and understanding that for the moment you have a problem. And I think that is true of many persons who are young voters. By young, I mean maybe anybody under 35 or whatever you want to define, but very clearly this voting group is not voting in the same direction as those who are 60 and over, or maybe even 40 and over. And in the past election, there was not the intensity of youth vote for Barack Obama as there was 4 years before. There was just a lot of non-voting, as a matter of fact, in primaries as well as general election, which is too bad. But my guess is that there's going to be much more of an appeal by Republican candidates to younger voters. People are saying it's sort of a subliminal aspect of Marco Rubio's talk tonight, that he does come at least with a Hispanic focus, talking about immigration, but he's young too. And maybe this is a little different than the graybeards that are elsewhere in the Republican Party.
Hello, hi. My name is Brendan. I'm an undergraduate senior here. And my question to you was whether you think filibuster reform is a possibility for the near future and how you think that might affect the hyperpartisan nature in Congress.
I don't think there'll be any further changes in the Senate rules in this Congress. Very quietly, some accommodation occurred between Senator Reid and Senator McConnell. It occurred essentially on that portion of the debate of the right to bring up the bill or even to get it discussed. In the past year or so, there have been filibusters even on the right to get the bill on the calendar or on the floor. So that I think they've agreed is going to be dispensed with. Once the bill is on the floor, why then the same rules pertain. In other words, as opposed to it finally coming to a conclusion, why one party or the other could decide they want to have extended debate, in quotes, or a filibuster. And there's been no change in that, and I don't anticipate there will be much more discussion. I think essentially the parties involved, the majority, got what they wanted. Now, there were other Reform Democrats who said, you know, we were not here during the Civil Rights Revolution, or even during the time when it moved from a 2/3 vote for cloture to 60 votes. And as far as we're concerned, as young Democrats in the Senate, we want to see a new regime. And so they may get their way in due course, but they don't have anything close to a majority in the Democratic Party, quite apart from the Senate currently.
Hi, I'm Ted Fisk. I'm an education writer. At the risk of going off in a quite different direction, what would you do about North Korea right now?
I would, first of all, get much closer to China on the issue. Now, everybody will write that the Chinese really have their own policy there, and it's one of containment of the problem. It's one of extolling stability, however cruel and difficult it might be. And so one of keeping all the North Koreans out of China, or making certain there's not a war between the North and the South Koreans that would infect the Chinese predicament. So from a pragmatic standpoint, they're able to tolerate a good bit. At the same time, I think that United States diplomacy has to become more adept. I think it has become more adept in dealing with China. There was a time 4, 5, 6 years ago where sometimes at the highest levels, sometimes a meeting occurred. But now more and more of our diplomats at various levels and different kinds of departments are with back and forth with the Chinese. And that's tremendously important, that this communication be much more intense so that there conceivably could be a more practical accommodation. Because the Chinese at some point will face not the problem of a North Korean nuclear weapon, but some outbreak between Pakistan and India that might occur through the attack on Mumbai or various other things and some irrational response. And so the Chinese and the Americans have got to work together in the whole area for Chinese security in that standpoint. With North Korea itself, I think it was a good idea for the people from Google to go into China recently. And I admire at least they're doing so, along with former Governor Richardson of New Mexico. I think the fact that more Americans might make those trips is something we ought to discuss a good bit more. Their trip was condemned by some who said, well, this sort of humors or recognizes the North Koreans. Well, we recognize them. They're there. It's a problem. We tried to deal with them before by economic sanctions of the most clever way of getting to the actual monies of the governing persons themselves, so that they finally had some anguish and decided to make some reforms in their nuclear program before. I have a staff member, or did, Keith Luce, who went over with Sid Hecker to North Korea, have been in Yongbong, have seen at least what they have had conversations. But the lack of communication with North Korea, in the same way that we were lacking communication with China a while back, is a severe problem. We really have to improve on that. Now, finally, we always do get the United Nations and the Security Council thereof and so forth to condemn this test and all that it means. But we have to recognize, I suppose, practically, the young leader probably has at least some advice, or maybe he thought of himself, to first of all have the missile tests in December or whenever it was, which everybody thought would be followed by this test, which has occurred, and the condemnation of the United States and the implication that somehow they're building a smaller and smaller warhead that might fit on a longer and longer range missile that might get to the United States. And now, no one knows the size of either of the situations, but this is the implication the North Koreans want to give, that the United States has got to treat them better, that more respect is required. Well, leaving aside all of that, the fact is that we do need to get into North Korea with diplomats, business people, so forth. And finally, I would add, even while we're doing that, and we are getting better at this, we need to get our own broadcasts into North Korea via the social media or any other communication device. So they're already, as reports, I read a very good piece in The Economist magazine this past week on North Korea, in which they pointed out, and I didn't realize how many people in North Korea are receiving news broadcasts from the United States and from elsewhere now. And so this is opening up, but that's going to be imperative. That's very important in Iran right now. We had a good program going there, and my encouragement has been to accelerate that. There really has to be this conversation of ordinary people with the rest of the world, some recognition of what is occurring elsewhere. And that may finally leaven up the situation.
We have time for one last question.
Hello, Senator. My name is Philip, and I'm a junior here at Duke. My question is more of something I'm curious about. Is there any issue on which early in your career you felt very strongly about, but later found yourself having a complete paradigm shift, and why?
Oh, I'm sure there have been. Trying to think about all the twists and turns that we've had. I suppose that probably when I was a boy, my dad was very, very partisan Republican. This was exciting when I was an 8-year-old and we sat up at 3 a.m. seeing Wendell Willkie nominated and the Republican. And I, with my little brother, crept down to the monument circle, got all the way underneath the monument where the great man was speaking and so forth. A photograph the star took, which shows us clearly intruding into that. I was very excited about that and probably shared my dad's feelings as he condemned Franklin Roosevelt because Roosevelt's agricultural policies had stopped him from planting as much corn as he wanted to plant or wheat or so forth, under the misguided thought that if you limited supply, the price would go up. You know, this would be totally out of sorts of feeding the world now, but at the same time, that was the policy of our country for quite a while. So over the course of time, however, why I learned that there were other views. That was certainly true during my educational experience in college over at Oxford when I went over there, when I became an intelligence briefer for Admiral Burke in the Navy and read The Secrets of Secrets at midnight and briefed the admirals. And, you know, these are all experiences which lead to a much broader base, really, for thinking through problems, so that I wouldn't say I became more tolerant of other views, but I think that's maybe a good word. And finally, on occasion, actually accepted them. I think that's been the case, really, as I'm talking about governance now today. It doesn't mean denying things that you think are important, but it means if the country is to succeed, if somehow or other we're to reach decisions which are important for the livelihoods, if not the life and death of in security situations, then you need to listen carefully. And sometimes maybe accede to something that's 2/3 of what you would have liked, as opposed to insisting. And I think this is the real division now, the my way and the highway business, as opposed to an ability, really, to reach some accommodation, conversation, and compromise.
So thank you. Thank you,
Well,
Senator.
thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.